Okay, hello everyone, and this is Bio110 Ambassador Program for this course. And before I start my presentation, I would like to uh, express my sincere gratitude to Professor Lee, Bio110 and Duke Wenchang University. Before taking Bio110, biology was to me mostly a collection of terms and concepts, but throughout this course, I began to understand biology as a dynamic and quantitative system. I learned how fundamental processes such as ion transport across cell membranes are essential for sustaining life and enabling functions like neural signaling. What impressed me the most was how Bao110 connected theoretical concepts with real laboratory experiences. Through hands-on experiments, I was able to see how abstract ideas from lectures actually uh, manifest in real biological systems. So this helped me develop a deeper appreciation for how cell functions and maintain internal balance. So as a student with a strong interest in scientific computing and mathematical modeling, this course also inspired me to explore how biological systems can be understood through quantitative and computational approaches. Actually, it inspired me a lot. And finally, I would just like to thank Professor Lee again for your inspiring teaching and DKU for providing such an excellent learning environment. Bao110 truly changed the way I see biology, not just as a subject, but as a living dynamic system governed by fundamental principles. And I would like to begin my presentation with a famous quote by the biochemist Oscar Hecher, who once said, "Life is the battle against sodium." At first, these statements may sound surprising. Why would life be a battle against something as simple as sodium ions? However, this quote captures one of the most fundamental principles in biology. Living cells must constantly regulate ion concentrations to survive and function properly. In particular, sodium ions play a crucial role in generating electrical signals in the brain. Our neurons rely on carefully controlled ion transport across the cell membrane to produce the electrical activity. Without these ion transport processes such as thinking, movement, and communication between neurons would not be possible. This leads to an important question. How does ion transport power brain electricity? So in this presentation, I will explain how ion transport across cell membranes enable neural signaling, how this process is connected to the biological concepts we learned in Bio110, and why this is essential for sustaining life. And one of the most important ideas in biology is that cells behave like tiny batteries. And just like a battery stores electric energy using a separation of ion concentrations inside and outside the cell membrane, in particular, uh, sodium ions are the most concentrated outside the cell, while potassium ions are more concentrated inside. This difference in ion concentration creates what we call an ion gradient. So, however, the membrane is selectively permeable, meaning that some ions can cross more easily than the others, and some cannot. Because potassium ions can leak out more easily than sodium ions can enter, the inside of the cell becomes more negatively charged compared to the outside. This thing creates a voltage difference across the membrane, known as the resting potential, as shown in the figure here. This electrical potential allows cells, especially neurons, to store energy and generate electrical signals, which is why we can think of cells as biological batteries. To understand how cells maintain their electrical potential, we need to examine the sodium-potassium pump, one of the most important molecular machines in biology. So the sodium-potassium pump is actually it actually transports ions across the cell membrane using energy from ATP. Specifically, it pumps three sodium ions out of the cell and two potassium ions into the cell. This process goes against the natural diffusion direction, so it requires energy. But by continuously moving sodium out and potassium in, the pump establishes and maintains the ion gradients that we discussed earlier. In other words, the pump charges the biological battery by creating a separation of ions across the membrane. However, the pump itself does not directly generate electrical signals. Instead, channels allow ions to flow down their gradients. When these channels open, ions will move across the membrane, and these movements generate electrical currents. So, in summary, The sodium potassium pump creates and maintains the ion gradients. And ion channels use the gradients to produce electrical signals. Together, they enable neurons to function properly. Now that we understand how ion gradients are established, we can then explain how neurons generate electrical signals known as action potentials. Action potential is actually a rapid change in the membrane voltage as shown in this graph. At rest, the membrane potential is around minus 70 millivolts. When sodium channels open, sodium ions rapidly flow into the cell driven by the ion gradient created by the sodium potassium pump. This influx of positively charged sodium ions causes the membrane potential to rise quickly, reaching positive values, and this phase is called a depolarization. After that, the potassium channels will open, allowing the potassium ions to flow out of the cell, and this causes the membrane potential to decrease and return towards its resting value in a process called repolarization. This entire process happens very quickly, typically within a few milliseconds. And these rapidly voltage changes allow neurons to transmit electrical signals, enabling communications in the nervous system. And in summary, the ion channels use the gradients established by the sodium potassium pump to generate action potentials, which form the electrical language of the brain. So how we have discussed how the ion gradients and ion channels generate electrical signals in neurons. But these processes are highly dynamic and happen all the time. To better understand this, we can visualize both the membrane and voltage and the net ion movement together. To better visualize this, I actually did a simulation, and you can see that the code is written by myself. And on the left, we see a simplified version of this whole process, and you can see that this is a membrane cartoon. The blue and orange particles represent sodium and potassium ions. The movement represents the net ion flux across the membrane. This is not a molecular level simulation, but rather a conceptual visualization showing the overall direction of the ion flow. And on the right, we see the corresponding membrane voltage over time. When ion channels open, ions have move across the membrane, and this causes rapid changes in voltage. This produces the characteristic spike shape known as the action potential. Below that, the phase plane shows the system's dynamic trajectory, which illustrates how the membrane voltage evolves and eventually returns to its resting state. And this visualization will help us connect ion movement with electrical signals, showing dynamically how ion transport powers neural electricity. To better understand the dynamic behavior of neural electrical activity, we can also use a mathematical model, which is my expertise, to interpret this one. This is called the FM model, which is actually a system of differential equations, and this model provides a simplified description of how membrane voltage changes over time. In this model, the variable Vt represents the membrane voltage, and its rapid increases corresponded to depolarization, which is caused by the influx of sodium ions into the cell. The variable Wt will represent the recovery process. This corresponds to the slower phase of the action potential, where potassium ions flow out of the cell, help the membrane return to its resting state. And the term IT represents an external stimulus, such as an injected current or synaptic input. This stimulus can trigger the voltage spike that we observe in neurons. Although this model is simplified, it captures the essential biological mechanism: fast sodium-driven activation followed by slower potassium-driven recovery. This helps us understand how ion transport leads to electrical signaling in neurons. And so far, we have seen how a single neuron generates an electrical signal called an action potential. But neurons do not function in isolation. The true power of the nervous system comes from this communication between neurons. As shown here, when a neuron generates an action potential, this electrical signal travels along the the axon towards the synapses. And as the snaps, the signal can trigger the next neuron, causing it to generate its own action potential. And this process is called neural coupling, where the activity of one neuron influences another. And and even a single spike in one neuron can trigger a chain reaction, allowing signals to propagate through neural networks. And this communication mechanism enables essential brain functions, including sensation, movement, learning, and memory. From a biological perspective, this entire process depends on ion transport. The sodium-potassium pump maintains the ion gradients, ion channels, generate action potentials, and these electrical signals allow neurons to communicate with each other. And this shows how ion transport ultimately powers neural communication brain function. The ion transport mechanism we discuss are not just theoretical concepts, and this can be connected to the real world. They are essential for many real-world biological functions. First, brain signaling depends entirely on action potentials. Every thought, sensation, and movement relies heavily on electrical signals generated by ion transport across the cell membranes. Second, the heartbeat is controlled by electrical signals in cardiac cells, and these signals are generated using the same fundamental mechanism, where the ion gradients and ion channels produce rhythmic voltage changes that regulate heart contractions. And third, muscle contraction also depends on electrical signals. When a neuron sends an action potential to a muscle cell, ion channels open, triggering the muscle to contract, and this allows us to perform everyday actions such as walking, breathing, and speaking. And all of these processes rely on the same core principle. Ion transport across cell membranes enable electrical activity in biological system. And so far, I have finished all my presentation. And thank you again. Thank you, professor. Thank this course to help me to think biology as a new research area to me and to apply what I have learned at DKU to connect the concepts together and to become to make my research more interdisciplinary. And that's all for my presentation.